Hey guys, just a fair warning on this review. I lost like half the audio from my microphone when recording this. I screwed something up. So the first half of the review, the first like 7 or 8 minutes or so, are just using the audio from my camera, which is not nearly as good. But I've now know to look out for that and know what the issue was, and it won't happen again. And enjoy the review. Buckle up. It's a long one because this Boris album is a long album. Hi everyone, I'm Zach Reinhardt, here to review the new Boris album, Dear. Boris is a band that should really need no introduction. They are a three-piece rock and metal band of various subgenres that have been around for over 25 years now, and this is their 23rd studio album. Before I get into Dear, I do feel it pertinent to address and kind of respect the monstrosity that is the Boris discography. Boris, like I said, been around for 25 years, and they put out a lot of music over that time, over a lot of different sounds. I feel their range is probably best exemplified by listening to their debut album, Absolute Go, which contained one single hour-long crushing drone metal track, and listening to some of their more recent efforts in the noise and new album era, where they're exploring kind of dreamy, shoegazy pop. While these albums are very different sonically, they do both exemplify Boris's love of slow, methodical songwriting, even if, in the latter example, the songs are a bit more bite-sized than an hour. You could also look at Boris's more typical punk and metal stuff in albums like Pink, Amplifier Worship, and the first Heavy Rocks. Yes, they have 2 albums called Heavy Rocks. And you could dive into their softer long-form works with albums like Flood and my personal favorite Boris album, Feedbacker. And that's not even mentioning the countless collaborations and EPs and various odd projects that show up in their discography. They've worked with people like Sun, Merzbow, and one of my favorite bands that I discovered this year, Indon. Boris's discography is sprawling, overwhelming, and somewhat disorientating, and it really just occupies any point in the heavier side of the rock, metal, and punk spectrum. If you're not into Boris, you really should be. They, maybe along with Melt Banana, are kind of the ambassadors of underground, noisy rock music from Japan to the rest of the world. As for where to start, that's a difficult one. Hit me up in the comments if you need help. But having gotten that out of the way, we can get into this new album, Dear. On this latest leg of Boris's journey, we see the band returning to their home amongst the fires of Mount Doom Metal, bringing with them much knowledge and treasure that they've gained from exploring the lands of dream pop and shoegaze. Mainly the knowledge of how to put reverb on vocals. Silly fantasy metaphor aside though, this album really is them returning to a lot of their older, heavier, dronier sounds. A lot of distorted, deep, low, just rumbling guitars appear on this thing. But it has a lot more attention to harmony and kind of pretty, clean vocal doubling that cuts through the mix really well, and a lot of use of atmosphere and just using a lot of echoey, reverby stuff on really all the instruments. The drums are very resonant on this album. It just has a bit more attention to harmony and being pretty and atmospheric than a lot of the older Boris stuff did. This thing kicks off with the track Down, which is an acronym that stands for Domination of Waiting Noise. And the song starts off with these huge resonant drums and this just crushing, loud, rumbling, distorted guitar that just comes in and really sets a tone for the album. It really sounds like an announcement that Boris is returning to this dronier, heavier sound. The tone of the guitar is just monstrous and thick and fat, and it sounds really great, but it's playing a surprisingly light-hearted and not oppressive and dark and hopeless sounding progression. It's actually somewhat uplifting, especially when the very clean, reverby vocals cut through the mix like a knife. The song really feels like an intro for the whole 6-minute runtime, and that's what it is. It is the introduction to the album, but I find its abrupt ending and lack of a transition into the next song to really just disrupt the flow of the album right off the bat. The song ends with all of this squealing feedback and rumbling distortion, and I really want that to transition into the next song, but instead it just suddenly cuts off, and the next track, Dead Song, starts off with just some soft, ambient electronics. We get those big, distorted guitars again, but this time they play much more of a background role. They kind of serve as just a bed of noise for all of this ambient, atmospheric stuff to play on top of. And I do like a lot of the noise and electronics that's going on in the background. It's constantly morphing and keeping itself interesting throughout the track, and a lot of Boris's more atmospheric stuff in the past has been kind of hit or miss for me, but this one I feel is definitely more of a hit than a miss. But it does have another really abrupt ending in it, though I'm a little less bothered by this one just because it doesn't feel like it was setting up a transition as much as the first track, Down, did. The third track, Absolute Go, is where we get a bit more of the classic Pink era Boris. There's more upbeat drums, some kind of menacing, heavy metal riffs, a great guitar solo on this thing. Wada's lead guitar tone, as always, is just monstrous. And I really feel like making Absolute Go the second track would have made for a much smoother transition from Down. I do like this track. I think it's one of the better tracks on the record, but I am a little bothered by how clean and pristine sounding the vocals sound. It really clashes a little bit with the really rough and raw sound of the guitars and drums on this track. And while the production is pretty clean on this whole record and for the most part works out, I do feel that on this track it gets a little bit in the way of Absolute Go being all that it could have been. The next track, Beyond, starts off with these low, clean guitars and this reverby, resonant drums that are very soft and very played minimally. They just kind of set up this atmosphere for the song, and they're all somewhat muffled. It sounds like a pillow's been thrown over the track or something, and everything's just a bit bassier than it feels like it should be. And it really makes Wata's vocals, when she comes in, cut through the song really well because she has a very high-pitched voice and she sings at almost a whisper, and it makes for this really kind of eerie feel to the track that I actually like quite a bit. The song builds very slowly and really tries to understate itself as much as possible until about a third of the way in, when we get this sudden spike of these loud, fast tremolo-picked melodies and these heavy, distorted guitars in the background. The intensity is really turned up to 11 for a brief moment and then dropped back down to that same soft, atmospheric side with Wada singing. The song continues to build for a while, and I'm actually really liking this track at this point, but then once it finally reaches the climax of the song and the whole band turns up on the distortion and really starts playing some more of their typical heavy, drony stuff, and Takashi comes in, and there's some okay vocal harmonies and reverb on the vocals, but it just feels so incredibly predictable that it really loses me on the ending climax of the song. It feels really dime a dozen for Boris once they hit that climax, but the journey there I did find interesting, and I do like the first 2/3 of the track fairly well. And the ending isn't bad, it's just not very interesting. Another track I'm not too thrilled on is the sixth track, Biotope, which starts off with this like 4 on the floor beat and these kind of ambient, noisy electronics. And it's another one of Boris's more atmospheric tracks, and this one is definitely a miss for me. We do get some distorted guitars, but they're very distant and kind of buried in the mix, and we get this odd, kind of very slightly distorted lead guitar tone and some very reverby, very clean, very poppy vocals again. I just feel like this track goes nowhere for like 6 minutes. There's not really any progression except for the song just gets a bit louder and maybe the noise gets a bit more prevalent in the mix. But I'm not a fan of the kind of poppy vocals that are going on in the background, and the song just seems really forgettable once I'm done with it. However, from there on out, I think Boris does pretty well for themselves, and this album ends fairly strongly. The next track, The Power, is another kind of slower, heavier doom metal track that is totally instrumental and has just some really super heavy and menacing sounding riffs in it. I am a little disappointed by the middle section of it, though, when they bring in this really heavy, like kind of like face scrunchy riff that I like a lot, but they don't really do anything with it. I keep wanting them to build it into like some big groove, but they never do. They just kind of drop back into the slow, monstrous, kind of methodical melody that they were playing at the beginning. And overall, I think the track is okay, but I think it could have been a lot more. The next track, Memento Mori, is, I feel, the best example of Boris really executing well on the harmonic, pretty, and poppy side, as well as the doomy side. We get Boris's classic, doomy, drony guitars with tons of fuzz and distortion on them, but we also get a lot of atmosphere to it and some pretty harmonies as well from the vocals and synthesizers that appear kind of buried in the guitars. The song feels a little melodramatic, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, and the song actually reminds me a lot of like a metal version of something we might hear on David Bowie's Black Star. The song executes well on really all aspects, and I feel it's one of the better tracks on the record. And then we get to the 12-minute opus, Dystopia, Vanishing Point. This song has an interesting opening. It starts off with what sounds like melodica and or maybe some accordion, though it's hard to tell. It's filtered out and a little buried into the background, and I'm certainly no expert on those instruments. We then get these tribal drums that really just dominate over whatever was going on before, and then the whole thing kind of fades out and is replaced by these clean, reverby guitars, and I feel a little bit just confused by the beginning. I'm not sure what its purpose was, but it was certainly interesting. The song proceeds to take a kind of post-rocky feel as it builds with these soft, slow, clean guitars for several minutes. We get some very clean, reverby, doubled vocals that sound nice, and the whole thing is very spacey. It's very serene, though we do occasionally get these shots of noisy, distorted guitars that are kind of distant, buried under all of the atmosphere. I do start to get a little bit impatient with this build after like 7-8 minutes with it. It starts to get a little stale for me, but not too much after that. They do bring in the climax, and the climax was definitely worth the wait. We get more of Boris's classic distorted guitars, and we get a really great, very melodic guitar solo that also has a really great guitar tone to it. And the song ends on a really strong note, but it does end a little bit weird. The chord progression was surprisingly actually somewhat triumphant during the climax of the song. It's not incredibly depressing or dark like you might expect if you were only familiar with Boris's earlier stuff. And it kind of all ends in this big rush of feedback and noise that hangs in the air for a little while and fades out. And then they fade back in, something that sounds very similar to what was just happening with the heavy distorted guitars going on in the background and the same high-pitched, very clear, fuzzy guitar tone for the solo that's going on. But this time the guitar progression is a lot darker. It's a lot more oppressive and hopeless. It feels like when a movie ends on a happy note and then you see the credits, and then after the credits you get some glimpse like, oh, the villain is still alive. That's kind of how this song ends. And I'm really split on it. I'm not sure if it's a cool ending or if it just ruins the whole fact that there even was an ending to the song anyway, and just upsets the flow of it all. I feel like the answer is both, but it's definitely a interesting way to end a song, and it feels like a interesting way to end an album. But there's another track right after that, the title track, Dear. Dear takes the dark tone that we got a glimpse of with the ending of Dystopia Vanishing Point and really runs with it. The song is oppressive and dark and depressing. The song starts off with just a big hit of low, rumbling, distorted guitars that start off as this just disorganized mess. It feels like they're just tuning the guitar string lower and lower as it just drops in pitch. But slowly it coalesces into a discernible riff and chord progression that is just menacing and sinister sounding. The song builds with this darker tone for a while, and we get some super echoey, guttural vocals from Takeshi. The production is really on point on this track. The drums sound great, the guitar tone is awesome, and everything is just mixed so well. It feels just like a massive wall of sound hitting you. We get a nice, noisy, heavy climax to the song, and the song ends in just a big wall of noise and feedback and just distortion that dissolves into nothing to end the album. With how surprisingly not dark and depressing this album is, when this final song comes on and it just sounds so sinister, it really feels like a twist at the end of the album. And I think it is a really solid track as well. Probably one of my favorites on the album. So, overall, this new Boris album is solid. It's got a lot of good songs on here, but there's a lot of, I feel, missed opportunities in some of these songs as well. There's a lot of points where I feel like they had something really great and didn't fully execute it to its full potential. But overall, I like most of the songs on here. I like a lot of what Boris is doing here. I do like this better than some of their other more recent projects, and I'm feeling a 7.5 on this album. It's a solid album. It's a solid new effort from Boris. There's definitely some good tracks on here, but is it anything close to a big, incredible statement like Pink or Feedbacker? No. But for what it is, it's good. And you know, Boris is always one of those bands that has just always put out music. They're super prolific. And just as a consequence of that style of composition and that approach to making music, not everything's going to be a super masterpiece. But there's definitely some great things on here, and a worthy addition to the Boris discography, I feel. So yeah, that's me. My throat is protesting for me speaking this long. I've been talking for a while. I'm probably going to cut this pretty short, though. And yeah, this was the new Boris album. It's called Dear. It's a solid Boris album, but not one of their incredible masterpieces like some of their past work has been. But Boris has definitely still got what it takes to put out great music, and they still are putting out great music. And I'll see you guys next week. Peace.